Hi, everybody, and welcome back to Chee-Tash. My name is Chris, and today we're going to be talking about 1984, Chapter 1, Part 3, pages 30 through 38. And boy, do we get a lot more information in this chapter. If you could say Part 2 was all about the person's kids, in Part 3, we find out about Winston's family and his past, which, I mean, his family is in the past, but how about this? His family and Oceania's past and the origins we get a little more depth into the origins of the party and Big Brother. Very, very interesting chapter. I say we just start right into it in the first slide. Right within the first few pages of Part 3, we get a glimpse into Winston's family. And he starts off right off the bat. He says that he is dreaming of his mother, so it sounds like he's asleep. He's back at his place, sounds like. And we get some interesting characteristics about each member of his family. And we find out he has a sister, too. So his mother disappeared when he was 10 or 11. He describes her as tall, statuesque, silent. She has fair hair. His father, dark and thin, dressed in neat clothes. And I want you to recognize this detail here is that Winston describes what they wear. And what they are wearing is different than the clothes than that of the party. Like different than what was described that Winston wears back in Part 1, which was like blue overalls. And then the kids, if you guys remember from Part 2, they're described as having dressed in gray and like a red neckerchief, which is like the typical wear of the spies organization. So from this comment, I can tell that this was before Big Brother took over. So something happened to his parents seemingly a long time ago, and he actually goes on to describe that they were swallowed up by the Great Purges of the 1950s. What was the Great Purge? I am not really sure. That's very interesting. Now, he also has a sister, but he doesn't really remember her much because I think she got swallowed up by the purges too, but when she was really young. And so he didn't really get to know her. She never really grew up, but he does say that she was a tiny, feeble baby and that she had watchful eyes. So we get a glimpse into his family life. And it's interesting to me that Winston can remember this now, whereas back in Part 1, when he was trying to remember his childhood, he was having a lot of trouble. And maybe, you can remember some weird things and your dreams. There's people who say your dreams can give you like a glimpse into your past or like repressed feelings, etc. So maybe he is only able to access this when he's sleeping. It could be. I'm just looking over here. He could not remember what had happened, but he knew in his dream that in some way the lives of his mother and his sister had been sacrificed to his own. So what happened to his parents? Why would his parents sacrifice themselves to save him and maybe not his sister? And why couldn't his parents escape this great purge? So we're getting a lot of information, but it's also asking a lot of questions into his past and also what happened in Oceania. And we're going to kind of talk about that here in a second because Winston is sleeping, like I said, but he has kind of like two sets of dreams here. So his first dream, it's basically on page 30. His mother is deep beneath him with his sister. So they are almost kind of like underground. They're looking up at him. He's above them, right? And he describes it as a sinking ship. They were in the saloon of a sinking ship looking at him through the darkening water. They could still see him and he them, but all the while they were sinking down. Okay. And then he goes on to say, like I said in the previous slide, they had to die in order for Winston to remain alive. So they had to sacrifice themselves. And he calls it a tragedy. He calls it a tragedy, which is interesting because tragedy to him is a foreign word. It seems like nowadays, in Winston's current time period, there's not a ton of emotion besides like the anger you see from the Parsons children, like towards Winston. You see the anger in the 2 minutes of hate. It's literally in the name of it, 2 minutes of hate. But there's not a lot of other, it doesn't seem like there's happiness, sadness, remorse, joyfulness. And he says on page 31, tragedy he perceived belonged to the ancient time, to a time when there were still privacy, love, friendship, and when the members of a family stood by one another without needing to know the reason. He goes on, such things he saw could not happen today. Today there was fear, hatred, pain, but no dignity of emotion or deep, complex sorrows. So like I said, so far we've only seen hatred, the 2 minutes of hate, the Parsons kids. I mean, look at the mother. She had fear of her kids. People fear kids, Winston talks about. So all these kind of negative emotions kind of reminds me of the 4 agreements and all these negative agreements. Not a lot of positive agreements. A lot of people taking things personally. A lot of people, what were the other agreements? Not keeping their word. I'm going to have to go back and review that. Now I forget the 4 agreements. But basically, the 4 agreements, the positive ones, those 4 that Don Miguel Ruiz talks about, like add energy to your life. The other ones suck energy from your life. And maybe this is a tactic of Big Brother, is these emotions that Winston describes, fear, hatred, pain, they keep you so hyper-focused on one thing, and they just waste your energy on it that you don't have energy to go out and better yourself or start a revolution. You're too angry at the stuff that you can't fix. Just a thought. And also, you're easier to control that way too. When everything is fear and hatred of, Goldstein or Eurasia, then you're constantly in that state of panic. You're just doing anything you can to defend. It's like in jiu-jitsu. When I go up against somebody who's really, really good, I'm always on my toes and always on my back. Very passive because I'm like, I don't know what's going on. I just got to defend. I don't have time to think about attacking. Similar thing here. So that was Winston's first dream. In the second dream he has this night, it's a summer evening and the sun is shining. So it seems like a really beautiful day. Landscape is not clear. Like he doesn't give like the name of the place, but it's familiar to him, like he's been there before. He called it the Golden Country. Old rabbit-bitten pasture. So he's been here before, or maybe he's dreamed about it before, but maybe he's also been there at some point. Sounds like a way beautiful place than London. And he describes this word dace. Somewhere near at hand, though out of sight, there was a clear, slow-moving stream where dace were swimming in the pools under the willow trees. So I don't know if this is like a specific Big Brother party word, like newspeak or doublethink. I just don't know what it means, if it's like a type of fish or something. So totally could be a false alarm, but I highlighted it anyway here. What ends up happening in this field is that the girl with the dark hair appears and she starts moving towards him. And So who I think he's referring to here is the dark-haired girl from part 1 that he describes that he doesn't really like her or trust her. Remember, he describes two people. He describes O'Brien. And then let me see if I can find... Here we go. Here's O'Brien. She works in the fiction department. Bold-looking girl. Disliked her from the very moment of seeing her. Interesting. It says he dislikes nearly all women, if you guys remember him describing that. So now he sees this girl here, and it's interesting. She's coming towards him. She tears off her clothes. And Winston doesn't really think much of it. Like, here's a guy, girl takes off his clothes, takes off her clothes, and he says that he's not really moved by it. He's not really fazed. He kind of just lets her do her thing, and he's just kind of standing there like, whatever. Barely looks at it, he says. But what he does notice and what he does note is that the sheer casting off of clothes like perks him up more than her being naked. He says with what overwhelmed him in that instant was admiration for the gesture with which she had thrown her clothes aside. It seemed to annihilate a whole culture, a whole system of thought, as though Big Brother and the party and the thought police could all be swept into nothingness. So her casting off of clothes is like rejecting the party. And it seems like Winston is trying to do this in his real life. The diary entry, what he writes in the diary, buying the diary. So yeah, buying the diary entry, the look that he gives to O'Brien. He's attracted by this going against the party because it's kind of seemingly what he kind of wants to do too. Last part of the dream, this is interesting. Winston woke up with the word Shakespeare on his lips. Very interesting. I don't know what this means. Obviously, they're in London, English. So maybe, well, think about it like this. Goldstein's book, they have banned. You can't even find it. Nobody knows where it is. Perhaps all books they've banned, besides anything that comes out of the party, especially Shakespeare, because I haven't read much Shakespeare. I've read like Romeo and Juliet, Julius Caesar. But would the party want you to read Shakespeare? Think about all the emotions that are happening in there, the stories, characters. They probably don't want you reading Shakespeare. But I don't know how that ties into this dream that he's having. So hopefully we can get a little more information on this. Because, yeah, I'm at a loss for why he wakes up with the word Shakespeare on his lips. And maybe Shakespeare is a totally different thing, not the author. Not anything to do with any of the plays. So he has those two dreams, and then he wakes up. He's got to get ready for work. And it's interesting, the thing that wakes him up from work is the telescreen. Much like the alarm that woke me up this morning was from my phone, which is, the telescreen honestly sounds like a lot like your phone. It's got a lot of the same functions. It can record you, it can take video, and it can do essentially what he's doing here is a Zoom call for this exercises that he's about to do. And the telescreen leads them in a morning exercise routine of the physical jerks. And he's got to start getting ready for that. One thing that's interesting, Winston does not sound good when he wakes up. He ends up having a coughing fit. He has a difficult time getting through some of the exercises when the physical jerks start. And he says that his lungs are slowing him down. He describes his lungs are slowing him down. Now, it could be the Victory cigarettes and the Victory gin. I don't know, just a thought. But we don't really know how much he smokes or drinks. So he's got some bodily issues like his ulcer. You know, he's got this coughing fit. And it really takes a toll on him. Let's see here, page 32, which it emptied his lungs so completely that he could only begin breathing by lying on his back and taking a series of deep gasps. Varicose ulcer had started itching again. So he has trouble climbing the stairs. He's got this ulcer. He's got this coughing fit. He seems in really bad shape. Really bad shape. And they go through these physical jerks, which essentially looks like a Tai Bo class. There's an instructor leading it. It sounds like she sees everybody through this screen because she ends up calling them out from the TV screen, which is crazy. I wonder how many people are taking a part in the physical jerks, because she does break it up. At the very beginning, she says 30 to 40 group, 30 to 40 group, take your places, please, 30s to 40s. So is it regimented? Does everybody in Oceania take part or just certain groups? And why even the physical jerks? Well, we're going to get to that in a second. So it's funny because she calls him out. She says, hey, you can go lower. You can push it. So he does end up pushing it, and actually he says he touches his toes for the first time in years from that motivation from the instructress, he calls her. It's interesting that Winston tries not to show dismay and resentment. And I'm assuming because they can see him through the telescreen. So he has to kind of feign, I don't know what you would feign, unemotionalness, non-emotions, happiness. But if you're not happy, just don't show any emotion, as long as it's not dismay and resentment. Well, it's kind of like when he goes and writes in the diary, he does it in a part of his house where the telescreen can't see him. So it's obvious that Winston can't be his true self. He can't show dismay and resentment. He can't let the telescreen see that he's writing in the diary. It's got to be tough to hide from that. At the ending of this part, the instructress says something interesting. We don't all have the privilege of fighting on the front line. So what does she mean by this? She means that they kind of talk about the war that's going on in Eurasia. And she's saying how we have to remember our boys fighting on the Malabar front and in the floating fortresses. And just think what they have to put up with, we should be able to put up with it too, kind of basically. Like if they're putting up with all this shit, we can at least get through these physical jerks. It's kind of like her tone in this. So I find that kind of interesting. And it kind of leads me to a certain hypothesis why the physical jerks are going on. But we'll get to that later. I think I have a discussion question on that, actually. So like I said, we find out about Winston's family in this chapter. Huge. We also found out about the past. So there was a time before the late 50s, before Big Brother, although it's very unclear when Big Brother came about. Let me just take a swig of my green tea. So it's very unclear when Big Brother arose, but before the late 50s, things were different. But it's hard for Winston to remember because everything seems faded. There's no records of it. You could remember maybe certain details, but you can't remember the full picture of the details, the atmosphere. There's long blank periods in Winston's memory of it. But he does mention one thing. He says even the names of countries and their shapes on the map had been different. So shapes, maybe land. So maybe there was some takeovers, other countries taking over other countries, so it's a lot different now. In fact, we're only really introduced to Oceania, Eurasia, East Asia. You're talking about continents here. So they're talking about countries as continents. Huge. Not the 200, 300 plus countries, continents, like continent-sized countries. And he says Airstrip 1, for instance, had not been so called in those days. It had been called England or Britain, though London, he felt fairly certain, had always been called London. So interesting, now it's not called England, it's called Airstrip 1. So things have definitely changed. What ends up happening, according to Winston, is there was a war during his childhood. So like in the 50s, because Winston's 39, right? And it's 1984. So yeah, that would be 50s, right? So during like the 50s, during his childhood, there was peace. That's what he remembers. But then there was a surprise air raid, and it sounds like there was a war that happened. And Winston remembers having to hide out in like a bunker or tube station, he calls it. And he remembers going down the steps with his dad, and he gets super tired. I find it kind of interesting. Going down the steps, he starts getting really, really tired. Spyro, which finally so wearied his legs that he began whimpering, and they had to stop and rest. This is him as a kid. He's remembering. And it's going, remember the first page of the book, he's going up the steps to his apartment, and he also starts to get winded too. Interesting parallel there. Also, how is Winston, again, he remembers a lot. But in chapter 1, part 1, doesn't really remember a whole lot. So what's jogging his memory? Maybe it's the physical jerks. I don't know. But he talks about this tube station. There were people sitting all over the stone-flagged floor, people packed tightly together. He meets an old man down there, and he describes the old man. He reeks of gin. His eyes were full of tears, and lots of grief, and he thinks the old man is grieving about losing a loved one. Is it described in some Winston graphs that something terrible had happened? His granddaughter, someone whom the old man loved, a little granddaughter perhaps, had been killed. And the old man is kind of talking to himself, and he says some interesting things. Quote, "We didn't ought to have trusted him. I said so, Ma, didn't I? That's what come of trusting him. I said so all along. We didn't ought to have trusted those buggers." But which buggers they didn't ought to have trusted, Winston could not now remember. So in the 50s, childhood, things were great up until a point. There was a war. There's obviously somebody that attacks England, whatever it was known at the time. But we don't know who. We don't know what. Let's continue. But Winston talks about the wars that are currently being fought. I think this is on page 35. So there was a war that changed everything. And now it seems like Oceania is in a perpetual state of war. And this is interesting because you can't say who is fighting who, because alliances and enemies apparently switch all the time. And there's no way to go back and look stuff up because there's no written record. There's no records of it. And think about in Oceania, the laws, well, technically there's no laws, but nobody's writing anything down. You have the speak right, which again, I've postulated that is not your property. That is the party's property. So they can essentially kind of control, even if you say what's on your mind, they have access to it, they can change it. I'm guessing a speak right has the ability to do that. So they don't want you writing anything down. The party writes stuff down. Currently, Oceania is at war with Eurasia and in an alliance with East Asia. But like I said, it flip-flops back and forth. And whoever you are currently at war with, that's who you were always at war with. So seemingly the past is always being changed. So next thing you know, next week they could be in a war with East Asia. Well, no, we were in a war with East Asia for years before this. But we were just in a war with Eurasia. No, we were not. We are always in a war with East Asia. Why do you think that they just flip-flop and no matter who you're fighting in the present, that's who you were always fighting? The enemy of the moment, this is Winston, enemy of the moment always represented absolute evil, and it followed that any past or future agreement with him was impossible. If the party could thrust its hand into the past and say this or that event, it never happened, that surely was more terrifying than mere torture and death. So just from Winston's description about Oceania's war companions and enemies, they control the past. They control what you remember. And again, maybe this is why Winston has such a hard time remembering things. But wouldn't, even if the party is saying one thing, you would still remember it in your mind, right? It's like when they took away Reggie Bush's from USC, the running back for USC, they took away his Heisman. But in my mind, I'm like, he still won the freaking Heisman. But like on record, he doesn't. He did not win the Heisman that year. He gave it back. But in my mind, I'm like, no, dude, he was the best player that year. He won. I watched him at the ceremony. He won the freaking Heisman. You know, that's on like a lower level, but it essentially sounds like Oceania is doing that here. Here's an interesting quote at the bottom of page 35 into 36. The party says, if all records told the same tale, then the lie passed into history and became truth. Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. It's one of the party slogans. So you see the kind of control that the party has enacted on Oceania. They're controlling your past. This is who we were always in war with. Coincidentally, they're controlling their future too, because you can't learn from the past. We've talked about this with Winston. He has nothing to remember stuff by, so he's perpetually just stuck, not learning from previous experiences. Who controls the present controls the past. We're currently at war with Eurasia. We were always at war with Eurasia. And here's this word victory that comes through again. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory. Reality control, they called it. In Newspeak, doublethink. Victories over your memory. Not enemy, but the memory is kind of an enemy in this aspect. Victories over your memory. This is how they control your reality. Victory cigarettes, victory gin, victory mansions. It's interesting why they are called that then. Because I used to think it had to do with the war effort. Now I don't really think so. Victories over your memory in order to control your reality. So are the mansions, are the cigarettes, are the gin victories over your memory? That's why they're prefixed with victory. Are they the thing that's controlling your memory? The shitty victory mansions. The cigarettes and the gin, which are not really good for you and have a potential negative health effect on you. Very interesting. So here we get introduced to doublethink. Or I think this was mentioned in part 1, but just like briefly. But now we know that doublethink is essentially reality control. So doublethink. You're thinking two things at the same time. It's kind of immediately what I go to, and it's not too far off. Winston goes on to describe it as knowing and not knowing. And it's basically being in a state where both two sides of the same coin are correct at the same time. You flip a quarter and it lands on both sides of the coin, which I guess technically can happen, but you know what I mean. Let's continue. He goes on, holding two pinions that canceled out. You repudiate morality while laying claim to it. You say that democracy is impossible, but say that Big Brother governs democratically. Consciously to induce unconsciousness. And he says at the very end, even to understand the word doublethink involved the use of doublethink. So how would this be important to the party? Doublethink. You think two things at the same time. Well, it helps with controlling the past, right? Oh, yeah, we're at war with East Eurasia. And then next week it's like, oh, no, they're our friend. They always were our friend. No, we were never in a war with them. They were always in alliance with us. Now our enemy is India or East Asia. I think this doublethink is a really important concept for Big Brother and the party because it's how he's able to control Oceania. Thinking two things at the same time. So there's no truth. There's no like absolute truth because, well, there's two sides are always right. You can't argue that anything is wrong. It's really weird. Really, really weird. But powerful tool for Big Brother, that is. Next slide. Altering the past. It's not really known. Well, Winston states that Big Brother took over in the 60s. And when they took over, just like what we were saying with alliances and who they are warring with, they just end up pushing back his memory. So like in Winston's childhood, yeah, things were great. But when Big Brother takes over, Big Brother says, no, Big Brother was around even in your childhood. Big Brother was always around and it was always great. Things are always great with Big Brother. And Big Brother's been around for a lot longer than the 60s. So they try to push all the memories you've had of the time before Big Brother out of the way. No, Big Brother was always here. And he describes it as consuming the past. I think this is on page 37. Yeah. Page 37. So he writes here, Big Brother figured as the leader and guardian of the revolution since its very earliest days. His exploits had been gradually pushed backwards in time until already they extended into the fabulous world of the 40s and 30s, when the capitalists in their strange cylindrical hats still rode through the streets of London. So, again, like we talked about in the previous slide, times were different. But Big Brother is saying, no, those good times that you're talking about, we were there too. It wasn't capitalism. That was Big Brother. And he says here, he thought it must have been at sometime in the 60s, but it was impossible to be certain. But that's his hypothesis. And then we see this word ingsoc again. He said he hadn't heard the word ingsoc before 1960. Party history books, it was not true, for example, or everything melted into mist. Sometimes, indeed, you could put your finger on a definite lie. Like he says, the party invented airplanes. But he says that he remembered airplanes from his earliest childhood. And Big Brother wasn't around back then, so how could they make airplanes? But they're saying, everybody, I made the airplanes. Big Brother is telling people that. So it's so hard to prove anything because they're so deep-seated in the history books and in the records of the past. Although Winston says, but you could prove nothing. There was never any evidence. Just once in his whole life, he had held his hands unmistakable documentary proof of the falsification of a historical fact. And on that occasion, cuts blank because this is where the instructress calls him out, so he never really says it. But this is a question. Although Winston had proof of falsification, What do you think that falsification is? How would you prove Big Brother wrong? Because it's one thing to have that proof, like, hey, I have proof. I have like video footage of airplanes in the 1930s. But who would you bring that to? Because Big Brother wouldn't want that getting out. What do you think that proof is? I think actually that is, and this is the last slide, folks. Discussion questions. Did I have that on here? Oh, maybe I don't. Well, maybe that's another question. What do you think is the proof of falsification that Winston has? Maybe we can add that to here. Yeah, these are the discussion questions, guys. Take a look at them. I am going to post these in the description. I won't go over them. I'll just leave them here. And I will post them on the description. You know what? Let's read them over. What do you suppose is the purpose of the physical jerks? How many people take part in this activity? We talked about that. What do you think? Why do you think Winston survived his parents and not his sister? Interesting. What changed from part 1 to part 2 to have Winston remember things about his childhood? Wow, look at that. I was seemingly talking to you guys about all these and I didn't even know it. Does Big Brother have a purpose to constantly being at war? Is there a motive behind this? Explain doublethink. We just talked about that. How do you think Big Brother is pulling off the heist of the past? And then if you want to add one more, what do you think is the proof that Winston had of the falsification of history by Big Brother? And that's going to do it, guys. Thank you so much for listening this far. We will have, next episode will be the discussions, going over the discussion questions. I don't know if I'll have a blog post out for this. I might have a blog post out for this one. So be on the lookout for that. I'll post that. And yeah, thank you guys so much for listening this far. I really, really appreciate it. Big things happening. I really, really appreciate it, guys. Thank you for being on this journey. My name is Chris. This has been Chee-Tash. Take care.